God's greatest revelation, how can his prophet forget parts of the Quran? Many people who had memorized the Quran died at the Battle of Yamama. We don't have to read all of this. You can read it in your own time. But basically what happened is when he died in 632, for the next 2 years, there were different battles. And one of them, the greatest, was the Battle of Yamama. And many of those who had memorized it died at that battle. So there's another problem. What are you going to do if many of those who knew the Quran no longer lived? Large part of the Quran may have been lost. Therefore, I suggest you, Abu Bakr, order that the Quran be collected, because so much could have been lost. That's why Abu Bakr wrote the first recension. So that which Muhammad did not do, his secretary did. He didn't have the Quran compiled, so it was Zayd ibn Thabit, his secretary, who was given the responsibility to do something which Allah's apostle did not do. Umar kept on urging me to accept his proposal. So he went and searched for fragmentary scripts of the Quran and collected it here and there. Then I said to Abu Bakr, how will you do something which Allah's apostle did not do? But Abu Bakr kept on urging me to accept his idea. Zayd had to go and get it from pieces of leaves, stalks, thin white stones, and the memory of men. So you can see it was piecemeal, that he had to collect it from many different sources. One verse in Al-Taba, only one person knew, which shows that maybe there were many verses that were lost. Now, I'm just quoting from their own traditions. This is not my material. This is their material. Another verse in Al-Azab, again, only one person remembered. Surah Al-Azab, I could not find it, he says, except that which Quzaymah ibn Thabit al-Ansari, whose witness Allah's apostle regarded as equal to the witnesses of 2 men. Therefore, that's why he used that verse. Apparently, the first Quran by Abu Bakr, there between 632 and 634, was not good enough. So Uthman, in the 3rd Caliph, about 20 years later, had to revise it a second time. Why do you have to revise a book that's perfect? A book that's eternal? A book that's without error? That's a question we should all be asking. One of the things he said while he was going to revising, he said, there are problems with dialectical problems. Now, I don't know how many people, does anybody here speak Arabic or read and write Arabic? Okay, you read in Arabic. Arabic always has 3 consonants, a consonantal. Don't point to him, I'm talking to you. You can do this as well as anybody. Just say yes or no and just obey me and you'll be fine, okay? But in Arabic, isn't it? It's all consonantal. And in order to know a dialectic difference, if you read a newspaper that you buy in Cairo, and you want to read it in Libya or you want to read it in Jordan, you're going to have a different dialect than the people in Cairo, right? You say yes. Now, in order for that paper to be sold both in Cairo and also in Jordan and also in Libya, you do not put any dama or kasra or fatta, which is the vowelizations, the a, the e, the u sounds. That you keep off, because everybody reading that newspaper would put different dialectic differences, which means you have to have the dama, the kasra, and the fatta to know what a dialectic difference is. But there were no damas, kasras, and fatta in the 7th century. They were only introduced in the 9th century. So how can he be talking about dialectic difference 200 years earlier? Well, take a look when Bukhari was writing. 870, the late 9th century. He was just talking about what the problems were with Arabic in the 9th century, redacting it back on the 7th century without realizing that historically it cannot make sense. Most of you are looking at me blankly. Don't worry. The Arab speakers who are watching this, they know what I'm talking about. Now, if you look at the traditions, you will see there are many traditions. I'm just giving you up there. When you get your own PowerPoint, you can take a look and see. These are the problems that we're coming up with. But let's look at some of the other things we're finding. This is what the classical account says, that some of the verses were lost, according to Ibn Dawud. Other verses disappeared, according to Asyuti. Some verses were forgotten, according to Sahih Muslim. Other verses were canceled, according to Sahih al-Bukhari. Some verses went missing, according to al-Bukhari as well, while other verses were overlooked, Ibn Abi Dawud. Some verses were changed, according to Muwatta Ibn Malik. And there are other verses that were modified, according to Ibn Abi Dawud. In fact, some verses were substituted, according to Sahih Bukhari. And then other verses were eaten by a sheep, Sunnah Ibn Mujah. Now, when you look at this, lost, disappeared, forgotten, canceled, missing, overlooked, changed, modified, substituted, or eaten by a sheep. Does this sound like a book which was compiled perfectly and completely? And I'm just quoting their own material. There's nothing here I've made up. I'm quoting their own traditions. Certainly those who wrote these traditions down in the 9th century did not make the claims that Muslims today are making. They knew that much of the Quran was missing or had been lost or disappeared. even eaten by sheep. So we need to go back and quote their own scholars. What about other difficulties? There were different recitations, different sequences, different collections, and different grammar. So let's open each one of these. Take a look at the recitations. This one is rather comical. According to Al-Khattab, he was listening to a recitation and noticed that he recited in several different ways, which Allah's apostle had not taught him. He jumped up, was about to jump up over during his prayer, but he controlled his temper, and when he had completed his prayer, he put his upper garment around the neck of and seized the man who was reciting it a different way, and he hauled him off to visit the prophet, because the prophet had taught him a different way. When he brought him to the prophet then, he dragged him to Allah's apostle, and when Allah's apostle listened to that recitation, he turned to Khattab and he says, hold on a minute. It was revealed in this way. This Quran has been revealed to be recited in seven different ways. So recited of it whichever way is easier for you. So what is this one recitation that they're talking about? It looks like there's many recitations, even according to traditions, the Prophet Muhammad was willing to accept 7. Well, it gets worse than that. 3 more were added, then another 4. Total 14 recitations by the 10th century. In the 1500s, the Ottomans had reintroduced the Hafs al-Asim, so that by 1924, when the Cairene canon was finally introduced at Al-Azhar University less than 100 years ago, all 14 existed. They only chose one of those 14 for the Quran that we use today. And that was then canonized in 1985 by the Ibn Saud family. Fahd Musaf is called by Prince Fahd himself, just 30 years ago. Yet today, there's still the Warsh that exists. In fact, there are others in that. The Warsh is the most famous, and that still exists in Northern Africa. So these different recitations still even exist today. There's different sequences to surahs. This is what we're really finding, especially with the newest manuscripts. Aisha said, show me the copy of your Quran. And when they showed it to her, Aisha said, this is the favorite wife of Muhammad. What does it matter which part of it reads first? She didn't really even care. So you can see, according to the earliest traditions, it was really a whole panoply of different recitations, different compilations, and of course, even different sequences. There was not just one Quran that comes from an eternal tablet that exists in heaven. And then what about the collections themselves? According to Sahih Bukhari, the 4 most authoritative collections of the Quran were written by Ad-Darda, Muad ibn Jabal, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Abu Zayd. But then according to Sahih Bukhari later, we also have another set of 4. Masud, Ubdallah ibn Masud, Salim, Muad bin Jabal, and Ubay ibn Ka'b. So which one are we to listen to? Which one are we to go to? And when you look at Ubay ibn Ka'b's, which became very popular in Damascus, that did not parallel the one by Ibn Masud, which became very popular in Baghdad, or the one by Ibn Musa, which became very popular in Basra. To say nothing of the fact that they didn't at all parallel the one that finally was chosen by Zayd ibn Thabit that became very popular in Medina. So 4 different cities, 4 different metropolitan codices, neither of them, or all 4 of them, do not parallel. Now, why? Well, most of the reason is because of competition between these different reciters, these different compilers. Abdul ibn Masud disliked Zayd ibn Thabit's copying the Musaf, and he said, oh, you Muslim people, avoid copying the Musaf and recitation of this man, which already admits that there is completely different recitations, different Musafs, different manuscripts. We won't get into too many of the grammar, but we do know that when the first copy of the Quran was written out and presented to the Caliph Uthman bin Affan, he said, there are faults of language in it. Ooh, that's quite an admission, if this is God's holy book, the greatest of all revelation. And then we get to the satanic verses. How many of you know about the satanic verses? Okay, a few of you. Now, not the book written by Salman Rushdie, that became famous here in the 1970s, but he was referring back to a well-known problem with the Quran, and that is when Muhammad supposedly was in Mecca, he received revelations about 3 goddesses, Alat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. When he then moved to Medina in 622, Jibril, the angel, then comes to him in the middle of the night and admonishes him for the fact that he holds that he carried or that he included these 3 goddesses in the Quran. And he said it was because of Satan was usurping you, was seducing you, that these verses were included, that these goddesses were included in God's holy word. So he asked him to expunge them out of the Quran, which he did not. They're still there today. You can see them. If you want to go and open it up to, you can go to Surah 53, Ayah 19 to 23. There they are, in full living color. And that's why this has been a real problem for many Muslim scholars. What do you do with Alat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza? Wait till next week. We're going to unpack that for you next week. We're going to show you who Alat, Al-Manat, and Al-Uzza. We now know who they are. And we also know who Allah is. But that's for next week. We're going to look and see who Allah is. And we're going to come back and we're going to look at these verses again. Because these are damaging, way beyond repair for Muslims. No, let's do a summary of the compilation. Muhammad did not feel it was important enough to write it down while he was living. By the time he died, it was too late. It took them 18 years to finally write it down. Some say 20 years. It could be either 650 or 652. Uthman was the one that was finally given the responsibility to write this book that I have in my hand today. This is the Uthmanic. By the way, I didn't ask permission to bring this in here. Is it okay? It won't hurt anybody. As long as I don't have a Bible with me, I'm sorry. If you can give me a bigger Bible, I'll put it up here next to me and it'll destroy this. And anyways, we're going to have this destroyed by tonight anyhow. Okay? But this won't harm anybody, folks. Please don't worry about the Quran. You don't have to bring it into your house if you don't want to. But I use this everywhere I go because of what we're finding out about this book. It's nothing more than a man-made book. And we'll show you that, and you'll see that after tonight. Verses were lost, disappeared, forgotten, canceled, went missing, overlooked, changed, modified, substituted, or eaten by sheep. 7 different readings, recitations, different sequences, different collections, different grammatical formats. Even Satan was able to include some of his verses. So let's look at the historical anachronism. Now, these are the historical anachronism. These are things that should not be there because historically they would not make sense in that same time period. Remember what Muslims say: the Quran is perfect, does not contain any errors, it has no history. Thus, the historical criticism created for the Bible, they say, does not apply to the Quran. Historical criticism that was created for the Bible is only biblical criticism. So we're taking, as Colin said, we're taking some of that biblical criticism and we're applying it to the Quran, like with like. If you look at the Quran, you will see in Surah 20, verses 85 to 87, 95 to 97, there's a reference to a Samaritan, Al-Samiti, who actually helped build or created the golden calf. While Moses was up in Mount Sinai, it was a Samaritan who built the golden calf. You can't have Samaritans that early. Moses was living in 1400 BC. We know where the Samaritans come from. They come from, I forget the name. It's not Shalmaneser. It's, anybody remember on the museum tour? Who's the one I'm looking for? Sargon II, thank you. By the way, there's 2 women from my team right over here. If you want to have any question, go to them. Why don't you stand up so everybody can see you? Sarah and Beth. They know every answer to every question, including who Sargon II is. This is the Fander team, and we're the ones that are actually compiling all this material, and we're using it every Sunday at Speaker's Corner, and we're debating it on campuses and around the world. Sargon II builds and comes down from Assyria, from Khorsabad, the city that he builds, and he comes down to down in the 7th century. So you're talking about a long time after. I'm going to pass it over here. A long time after Moses. And he takes out all the 10 northern tribes of Israel, replaces it with his own people from Assyria. They then marry the people that are left behind, and from their progeny come the Samaritans. All right? So you cannot have Samaritans before Sargon II in 722 BC. Moses is living in 1400 BC. How can you have a Samaritan in the Quran living at the time of Moses? Oh, I love it. He's 700 years too early. That's a real problem. The Quran introduces a mosque too early. In Surah 17, Ayah 1, it mentions that Muhammad went from the great mosque to the farthest mosque. The great mosque would be the mosque there in Mecca or in Medina, Mecca in this case, to the farthest mosque, which would be Jerusalem. How can you have a mosque in Jerusalem in 621? There were no Muslims in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not conquered until 652. So here you have 30 years earlier, you cannot even have a mosque, you can't even have Muslims there. So here's another anachronism. In fact, just go back. The first real, if you want to call it a mosque, the first building that was really created there is the Dome of the Rock. That's 691. Al-Aqsa Mosque was not built to 709. So you've got a real problem. I'm sorry, 710. Surah 34, ayah 10 to 11 talks about, we shall make full coats of mail and calculate precisely the links. The difficulty with this is, that's according to David's story. David was living in 1000 BC. Chainmail were not invented until 200 BC, 800 years later. Again, another historical anachronism. The Quran assumes there's a crucifixion much, much too early. Remember, crucifixions were created and invented by the Phoenicians, who then gave it to the Romans. And they did that in 500 BC. But according to Surah 7, ayah 122 and 124, Pharaoh has people crucified. As also in Surah 20, ayah 71, Surah 26, ayah 49. But Pharaoh is living at the time of Moses. So how can you have someone in 1400 BC crucifying or even using crucifixion that was yet to be invented in 500 BC, over 1,000 years later? And then he goes and denies the crucifixion. Not only does the Quran have the crucifixion 3 times with Pharaoh, when Jesus is crucified, he denies it and puts another man in his place in Surah 4, ayah 157. And as we said last week, completely confronting the notion that Jesus ever died on the cross. And remember, this is the greatest event in the history of mankind, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If Christ did not die or rise again, we're all damned. So this confronts the whole notion of who we are and what we believe. And yet, according to one verse, just one verse, Surah 4, ayah 157, it throws out Jesus, puts another man on his place, and lets that man die in Jesus' place. Now, if you ask, where does this come from? Because it certainly doesn't come from the first century, because all the historians, you have Thales and Phlegon, who are debating the crucifixion in 52 AD. Jesus died in 33 AD. Just 20 years later, they're debating the fact that when he died, the earth shook and the sun went dark, supporting what we see in the gospel account. And these are Greek historians. They're not Christians. Tacitus, a Roman historian who hated Christianity, talked about the crucifixion of Jesus, and it said that it happened under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. That's why we know it's 33 AD, because of Tacitus, the Roman historian, not a Christian. Josephus, Jewish historian, mentions that at the time that Jesus died, not only mentions the death of Jesus by crucifixion, he also mentions the brother of Jesus named James, his death, and curiously even refers to the fact that the Christians believe that Jesus rose again. The only extra biblical reference we have for the resurrection by Josephus, a Jewish historian, writing in the early 2nd century. So there you have Greek historians, Roman historian, and a Jewish historian, all supporting the fact that Jesus died. So where did the Quran get it wrong? Another historical anachronism.